welcome. Thanks for coming. We appreciate you all being here. This is a lecture in the series of Psychological Humanities and Ethics lectures that takes place here at BC. It's also sponsored by the Lynch School of Education and Human Development, so we welcome you. We're very pleased to have our speaker today, Liz Gulliford, and our respondent, Steve Sandage. The title of Dr. Gulliford's talk is Forgiveness, Gratitude, and Hope, a Positive Psychological, Philosophical, and Theological Examination. She's going to speak with us about positive psychology, which is a bit of a phenomenon out in the academic and practical world, and she's going to share with us her perspective, which both appreciates many of its strengths, but is also critical of various aspects of the program. We've had with us a delegation today from the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues at the University of Birmingham, and Liz is a representative of that delegation. The director, James Arthur, Christian Christensen, and various of their colleagues have been with us, consulting with us about programs in the Lynch School and in the Center for Psychological Humanities, and we've appreciated their presence, the advice that they have given us, and we're very much looking forward to the lecture today. Positive psychology engages with questions around how it is that we should facilitate human flourishing. And that, of course, is cognate with or aligned with some aspects of the Boston College mission around formative education, the development of whole human beings toward meaningful lives. So we're looking forward to Dr. Gulliford's remarks today, and we thank you all for being here with us to join in with the lecture and the visit. So Dr. Liz Gulliford is an honorary research fellow at the Jubilee Center for Character and Virtues in Birmingham. She's also an associate professor in psychology at the University of Northampton. She got her doctorate and her master's degree at the University of Cambridge. She does research on positive psychology and on various character strengths and virtues, including gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, courage, and hope. She's published in many highly respected journals over the course of her career. We're grateful to have Steve Sandage with us. He's the Albert and Jesse Danielson Professor of Psychology and Religion, Psychology of Religion and Theology at Boston University. He's also the research director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology. He's written many books, had funded projects by the Templeton Foundation, the Lilly Endowment, the Fetzer Institute, and we're very pleased that he was able to come down the road here, down Commonwealth Avenue, to join us today as respondent. So first we'll have Dr. Gulliford give her presentation, about half an hour or so, and then Dr. Sandage will come and give his remarks in response. Then we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. And when we're done, please join us. There will be a reception directly across the hall in the lounge there, and you are all welcome to join us for that. Dr. Gulliford.
So thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Wortham. Thank you so much for the invitation to come here today. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights on positive psychology and its interpretation, really, of forgiveness, gratitude, and hope. So I'll begin with a little overview of the talk. Stanton did just mention about positive psychology being a focus in psychology on human flourishing, and also how to promote human strengths as well. Now, I think that developments in that relatively new field of positive psychology have focused sustained scholarly attention on character strengths and virtues like forgiveness, courage, hope, compassion, etc. And I think that is to be welcomed. On the other hand, I think these positive psychological approaches to character strengths could be enriched through greater engagement with interdisciplinary accounts of these virtues. And that's why I think the work of the centre here is very important, actually, in locating the need for psychology to be broadened out in the Centre for the Psychological Humanities and Ethics. So I'm going to take an interdisciplinary approach to examine forgiveness, gratitude, and hope. Now, you got a little bit of the backstory actually already in the introduction there. So yes, I did my first degree in theology. And doing a paper on the psychology of religion marked the beginning of a transition, actually, to studying psychology. Specifically, I was looking at the topic of forgiveness. I was interested in how we actually help people to forgive, and that is a psychological question in many ways. Then I went on to do my MPhil and PhD at Cambridge, and then I was at the Jubilee Centre for 6 years, from 2012 to 2018. I was appointed at the University of Northampton to teach positive psychology. But I would like to qualify that a little bit by saying I teach what I would call critical positive psychology. So I think it's important to shine a number of different critical perspectives on positive psychology rather than just teach it as it is. So I want to begin by implanting some questions in your minds. Don't sound slightly scary, but it's not meant to. And that focuses on the different emphases across disciplines with regard to these virtues in terms of what is the value of these virtues? What are the grounds for forgiveness, gratitude, and hope? And what ends are served by forgiveness, gratitude, and hope? So just have in your mind, as I go through this talk, the question of what's at stake here, what's being valued, what the grounds are, the means through which we can forgive, be grateful, and hope, and the ends that are served by them. So psychological interest in forgiveness began in the 1980s, really in the 1990s, and it was the focus of my MPhil, Theological and Psychological Aspects of Forgiveness. And that's actually where I read some of Professor Sandage's work on forgiveness, To Forgive is Human, back in 1997. He'd written that with colleagues. Now, shortly after that time, in around the early 2000s, positive psychology came on the scene, and forgiveness was one of the kind of virtues of Peterson and Seligman's values in action, VIA classification. And this kind of brought forgiveness even further into the sort of psychological spotlight, really, with more and more research going on since that time, and it really mushrooming. Of course, forgiveness is valued in world religions, central to the Christian faith. It's upheld as an ethical ideal, although, of course, there is always the question about whether forgiveness is always morally appropriate. Incidentally, we're going to be having to bracket out quite a few of those big questions today in the interest of time. But the question is, how do we forgive psychologically? What processes are involved? And I also want to say, how do we receive forgiveness as well? Now, at the time I was doing my MPhil, psychologists like Steve were beginning to illuminate the process of forgiveness and how people might be helped to realise this end. So people like Bob Enright, Ev Worthington, Steve Sandage, Mike McCullough as well. Now, time obviously won't permit me to go into detail about these psychological interventions, but in effect what they do is they flesh out an ethical ideal, and they offer the means through which people can be kind of scaffolded or helped to forgive. Now, there are two main types of psychological intervention. There are those that focus on reworking attributions of blame, and there are those that focus rather on cultivating compassion and empathy towards the person who's wronged us. Now, in the first case, it's more cognitive. The idea is that you go back over the kind of attributions of blame that you made. Perhaps they were made in the heat of the moment. Perhaps you need to look back over it and think what situational factors might have led somebody to snap at you. Were they going through a hard time? So the idea is that you rework these attributions, make them more situational, less characterological, and this loosens those kind of bonds of blame that we might have when we forgive other people. So this is associated with the work of Lewis Smeads, who talked about the metaphor of magic eyes for that kind of reworking of attributions. Also, Bob Enright talked about reframing an offender and trying to change this narrative of blame. The other approach, which focuses on cultivating compassion towards an offender, is a more affective approach. And that was sort of spearheaded in the work of Ev Worthington Jr. So psychology helps with the how of forgiveness, offering practical steps that might help people to forgive. Now, there's a wealth of empirical data that shows the effectiveness of these interventions. Some of the interventions are brief, some of them might take place over weeks, but there is evidence to show that they do help people to forgive others. And this illuminates this psychological approach, the human side of forgiveness, and its inevitable challenges. However, I think when you start to look at positive psychology more so than simply the psychology of forgiveness, there's a bit of a change here, and forgiveness is often construed as a means of effecting emotional repair, neutralizing negative emotions in the forgiver. This is kind of epitomized in the quote from Martin Seligman here, who's widely regarded as the father of positive psychology, when he says, "My aim is merely to expose the inverse relationship between unforgiveness and life satisfaction." So in other words, if you want to have more life satisfaction, forgiveness will help you. Now, of course, I'm not saying that forgiveness doesn't help to neutralize negative emotions, but there is this risk of grounding forgiveness instrumentally for its salutary benefit, that the reason that we engage in forgiveness is because it's good for our mental hygiene. The other thing I would say is that most of these psychological approaches to forgiveness emphasize the person who's doing the forgiving of other people, and they don't tend to look at the person's need to accept forgiveness themselves. So most of these interventions, most of these process models are actually about how to forgive other people, as if perhaps you don't need to be forgiven yourself. And this is actually reflected in many psychological definitions of forgiveness, which focus on granting as opposed to accepting forgiveness. Now, of course, the theological starting point for forgiveness is rather different, because it's based on the idea that it's human nature to fall short, and there's a universal human need for forgiveness. So within the theological discourse, forgiveness is as much received and appropriated as it is extended and offered to others. So there's more of a balance there between forgiving other people and receiving forgiveness oneself. In fact, extending forgiveness to others is potentiated by having received forgiveness oneself. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out here is that forgiveness isn't affected solely through our own agency. So we might want to engage in some of those process models of forgiveness. We might want to loosen attributions of blame, and this might be very helpful. But we're on our own if we're doing that. But of course, from a theological perspective, we may pray to God to forgive what humanly we can't forgive ourselves. So forgiveness isn't affected solely through our own agency. There's God's agency involved in the task of forgiveness as well. So I've summarized these different theological and psychological emphases in this table here, looking at the motivation to forgive, which in the case of positive psychology focuses on the salutary benefits to the forgiver, whereas in theology, the motivation is based on a compassion that we all fall short. That is human nature. The emphasis in positive psychology tends to be on forgiving other people, and again, in theology, we've got a balance here between, yes, forgiving others, but as we receive forgiveness ourselves. Who effects that forgiveness? Well, of course, within a secular psychological frame, it's just the individual. They go through, perhaps, working through these attributions, and so it's an intrapersonal process for the most part. Whereas, from a theological point of view, as I just noted, you could pray for God's help in forgiving others, so the individual isn't the sole agent of forgiveness. And then the goal. I was talking about what are the ends served at the beginning of this talk. Well, perhaps from a positive psychology perspective, the goal is increased positive affect and well-being in the forgiver, a sense of release. Whereas from a theological point of view, we also have that release. In fact, one of the words used in the New Testament to describe forgiveness is the word apoluo, which means to release. But at the same time, it's not about release and letting go of the person or the relationship. It's about release and reconciliation, if that's possible. So there is this different emphasis, really, in terms of the goal of forgiveness from a theological perspective as opposed to a positive psychological one. So I have done a few things over the last few years, a few book chapters on the sort of interdisciplinary approach to forgiveness, because today, obviously, I can only be very brief in giving you an overview through that table of what I see as the similarities and differences. So these are just some books that you could look at if you wanted to see more detail. So the next thing I want to talk about, really, and I've already touched on it a little bit, is the difference between individual and collective dimensions of virtue. So, as I've already said, positive psychology foregrounds the individual in this task of forgiveness. And we can become more forgiving through our own efforts and our own agency by putting into practice the reframing techniques or seeing the offence with the magic eyes. But I think this neglects the fact that virtues are cultivated and sustained in relation to and in communion with others. So being forgiven potentiates our forgiveness of others. And this collective dimension of virtue, I think, is particularly apparent in the case of hope, which is the next virtue that I'm going to put under the spotlight. Now, within positive psychology, optimism, hope, and future-mindedness have all been kind of stuck together. And I've actually done some work where I actually tease apart the differences between hope and optimism. If people are interested in hearing about that, I can direct you to some resources. But there isn't time to do that today. I'm just going to focus, if you like, on the family resemblances between hope, optimism, and future-mindedness. Now, learned optimism, I think, was one of the first concepts, really, that positive psychology had to work with. Martin Seligman wrote his book, Learned Optimism, in 1990, which is about 10 years before the advent of positive psychology. And there are other people working within the field on hope, such as the late Rick Snyder and Carver and Shea on dispositional optimism. But what you'll see in my summary here is that positive psychology focuses on promoting hopeful or optimistic dispositions to enhance an individual's well-being, attitude towards failure, and their pursuit of goals. So that's what optimism and hope are for. So if we look at learned optimism, the idea behind it is that the salutary benefits of optimistic explanatory style, also known as learned optimism, can be learned. So the characteristic pattern, again, of cognitive attributions that is associated with optimism can be emulated. And somebody whose characteristic pattern is more pessimistic can actually school themselves to have a different style of explaining success and failure. I would go into more detail. My original set of slides actually expanded on this, but again, there isn't time to go into this. But essentially, the idea is that these favourable patterns of attribution can be learned. And Seligman sees learned optimism as a means of increasing positive emotions about the future. So in that sense, optimism is a hedonic resource. And we saw how, in the case of forgiveness, Seligman talked about forgiveness being a means of neutralising negative emotions. Now we've got optimism being a way of increasing positive emotions. And what's it grounded in? Going back to that question that I asked at the start. It's founded in a confidence that's based on the individual's ability to examine and change maladaptive cognitions. So hold that thought. Now, if we look at hope theory, this is another theory of hope as opposed to optimism, which sees hope consisting of two factors, agency thinking and pathways thinking. Now, as the names suggest, agency thinking is essentially belief in one's ability to reach a goal, the little engine that could, that kind of thing. Pathways thinking is about problem solving to reach these desired outcomes. So you have a goal and you have a pathway towards it, and you have the self-belief through agency thinking that you will stay on track and meet that goal. Now, this is a graphic that represents Snyder's hope scale, and you can see how the agency and the pathways thinking is tapped by these different items in that questionnaire. So you can see I energetically pursue my goals is an example of the agency thinking. I can think of many ways to get out of a jam, an example of the pathways thinking that people would respond to on a questionnaire. So whichever way you look at it, in hope and optimism, they're seen as hedonic resources. These psychological models are largely cognitive, because you can stand back and change the way that you think, potentially modifiable personal traits that ground hope and optimism in beliefs about personal agency and control of these cognitive attributions, alongside problem-solving skills. These then have instrumental benefit in enabling an individual's pursuit of desired goals and their happiness and well-being. So the ground of hope in optimistic explanatory style is confidence based on the self's ability to change and manipulate these maladaptive self-beliefs. Hope and optimism are construed as internal, largely cognitive processes. So everything that's happening is happening within your head. It's the way you're thinking about things that's sustaining optimism or pessimism, its opposite. But what I want to suggest is that this doesn't take account, this really misses the mark, because it doesn't take account of hope's collective or shared dimension, which is grounded in a different type of confidence, and that's the confidence of trust, or hoping in. So hope is sustained in relation to other agents. It's not this purely interior personal resource. There may be aspects of hope that are within our control, but perhaps you know from your own experience that it's the expectations of significant others that influence our hope. Somebody, think back to a time when you felt really hopeless. Did somebody help you? Did somebody help to expand your perspective of the situation? I think this shows that a helpless individual may indeed be beyond the point of self-help. They might not be able to sit down, give themselves a talking to, think I should be cultivating an optimistic explanatory style. But they're not beyond help. Because to give a tangible example of this, when we go to see a therapist, when we go to see a friend, a counsellor, or an advisor, feeling hopeless, that person often rekindles hope in us. So hope is quite an interpersonal as opposed to a purely intrapersonal phenomenon. Now, this idea of hoping in goes back quite a long way to Thomas Aquinas, who said that the temptation to abandon hope may not be as overwhelming when we're able to hope in another's assistance. Now, naturally, Aquinas would regard God as the ultimate agent of that assistance. But he recognises that we may hope in other agents, fellow human beings, our friends. So we hope in other people, and we share a collective practice of hope. So here's Thomas. We hope rightly when we hope in God or neighbour, even if we do not obtain the particular object we hope for. It is unlawful to hope in any man or any creature as though it were the first cause of movement towards happiness. It is, however, lawful to hope in a man or a creature as being the secondary or instrumental agent through whom one is helped to obtain any goods that are ordained to happiness. It is in this way that we turn to the saints, and that we ask men also for certain things. So this interpersonal view of hope can be contrasted with the predominantly intrapersonal view of hope that I was talking about in psychology, the idea that hope is something that is purely regulated from within by our own kind of rational choices and decisions to change our explanatory style. But it's interesting, though, because if we turn back the psychological clock from positive psychology to psychodynamic psychology, we'll actually see some differences in the way that hope was seen by some psychodynamic psychologists. So I think it's good to promote salutary or positive styles of thinking that prioritise these self-determined or autonomous aspects of hope and optimism. I think it's good to buoy up agency thinking, self-confidence and self-belief, but I think we have to recognise that we can't in all circumstances bring things about through our own efforts. And I think sometimes that belief could be dysfunctional. And that hopes are often shared and kindled in the first place in trust or confidence. So this book, Images of Hope, by William Lynch, I think says it very well. He's talking here as a clinician about this interpersonal aspect of hope. And I think it's pretty clear, actually, that he would have been influenced by Aquinas as well. Hope not only imagines, it imagines with. We are so habituated to conceiving of the imagination as a private act of the human spirit that we now find it impossible to conceive of a common act of imagining with. But what happens in despair is that the private imagination of which we are so enamoured reaches the point of the end of inward resource and must put on the imagination of another if it is to find a way out. Whereas a more public act of the imagination comes far closer, I think, to describing the saving process that goes on in the modern psychotherapies. Two imaginations, that of the patient and the doctor, work together to discover and enlarge the possibilities of a situation. So I think this earlier psychology actually did emphasize the more kind of collective and interpersonal aspect of hope that I think has receded as we've seen the rise of positive psychology. So a culture of self-help does little to cultivate a more collective and interpersonal understanding of hope. I think positive psychology could take more account of the collective dimension of hope, which this earlier psychodynamic approach emphasized, and that, as I say, is resonant with Aquinas. The third thing I'm going to talk about today, as I said, is gratitude. Or am I? Am I really going to talk about appreciation? That's a question that I want to set in your mind. Now, gratitude is one of the success stories of positive psychology because it's been found to have a whole host of intrapersonal and interpersonal benefits. It's been shown to be this very reliable means of promoting happiness, well-being, and social connection, among other valuable goods. So some of the intrapersonal benefits of gratitude: grateful people sleep better. Gratitude improves psychological health, increasing happiness, reducing depression, helping to prevent emotions like envy, resentment, and regret. It improves physical health as well. It's related to fewer depressive symptoms, and people who are grateful are more willing to seek help for health concerns. That's probably what mediates the link, actually, between gratitude and physical health. But there are these interpersonal benefits as well. Of course, we all know that saying thank you is good manners. But we also know that it helps to build social bonds. It helps people to feel more connected. And that's not really a surprise if what you're doing is acknowledging the goodness of other people and their kindness. In a more applied sense, it can build morale in the workplace. One study showed an almost 18% increase in job satisfaction in nurses following a gratitude intervention. So there are a number of ways that people have tried to promote gratitude, but one of the biggies is to keep a gratitude journal. And psychologists Bob Emmons and Mike McCulloch were the first to show that keeping a gratitude diary for a couple of weeks significantly improves well-being. So people in their study, there were students in the study, there were people with neuromuscular diseases in the study, had better sleep, fewer symptoms of illness, increased happiness, increased positive affect, and decreased negative affect. But when we look at gratitude in positive psychology, it's often seen as a means of capitalizing on positive events. So going back to Seligman, he emphasizes the role of gratitude in amplifying subjective well-being in the beneficiary. So the person who is being grateful gets a double dose because they get to feel grateful, but then they get to feel happy by savouring and capitalizing on the event by calling it to mind in gratitude. He actually advocated keeping a gratitude journal as a means of, and those are my italics, increasing satisfaction with life and happiness. And he also proposed this gratitude visit where he showed that people who wrote a thank you letter, delivered it, read it out, experienced a boost of happiness and a decrease in depressive symptoms that lasted for about a month. So those people who did the visit were happier and less depressed than people in a control condition who were writing about their early memories for a week. Now, this was a one-shot thing, but the effects lasted for about a month in terms of positive emotion and a decrease in negative. But what I want to point out here is that the focus here is on the effect of gratitude on the beneficiary, right? So it's not so much about the person that you're grateful to. We're talking about foregrounding the benefits of being grateful to the person who is being grateful. And in that sense, that's why I want to question this idea of feeling gratitude, or is it really appreciation? Because you can feel grateful to others without ever attempting to reciprocate. And therefore, you could justifiably be viewed as ungrateful, even when recording high levels of grateful feeling in your gratitude journal or self-reported questionnaires. And that's because this idea of grateful feelings, or appreciation, isn't necessarily linked to the virtue of gratitude. So the virtue of gratitude requires a beneficiary not only to appreciate and acknowledge these benefits, but also to be moved to reciprocate behaviourally when a suitable opportunity arises. So Terry McConnell, whom I've met, the philosopher, notes that gratitude does necessarily have to be felt. It has to have an accompanying feeling to be fully realised. But while these grateful feelings in the beneficiary are necessary, they shouldn't be taken to be sufficient. That's not the whole story, feeling grateful. So gratitude involves feeling good, but it requires reciprocity towards benefactors when possible, or it could just slip into being appreciation. So as Navarro and Tudge point out, it's important to encourage the autonomous sense of moral obligation to reciprocate benefits and go beyond merely encouraging appreciation or saying thank you in order to promote the development of gratitude as a virtue. So Navarro and Tudge are developmental psychologists. They've done quite a lot of work on gratitude in cross-cultural contexts. So that's where they're coming from. Now, most measures of gratitude only tap these grateful feelings, but as there's more to the virtue of gratitude, as I've just said, than the feelings, my Jubilee Centre colleagues and I created the multi-component gratitude measure, which taps alongside these grateful feelings that people report, feelings of appreciation, taps people's underlying concept of gratitude, their attitudes towards gratitude, and also asks about their self-reported behaviours associated with gratitude. So do they make a deliberate attempt to call to mind their benefactors? Do they always try to reciprocate benefits and so on? And so that's the measure that my colleagues and I created in 2016. So the message I want to get across is that gratitude is not simply about boosting the beneficiary's positive mood and amplifying positive emotions, although of course it could have that effect. Research shows that gratitude does amplify the effect of positive events, and it helps to savour those events. So that's a good thing, and perhaps something that we want to try. But the question is this really gratitude, or is it appreciation that's the focus when people talk about amplifying these effects? Also, there's the question of whether we can be grateful in a way for negative events. So I think there's a difference between keeping a gratitude journal to increase one's subjective well-being and keeping a gratitude journal because you want to honour your benefactors. And I suppose in that sense, that would be a genuine gratitude journal where you recognise the benefits you've received from other people, you write about their efforts to help you, their friendship, and you keep the journal to honour them. In the process of doing that, it helps us recognise we're not the sole architects of all the good things in our lives, nor the sole authors of our successes. So this different emphasis on keeping the journal to acknowledge the benefactors. I also want to bring up this idea of gratitude for positive events and whether actually you can be paradoxically grateful for something that was challenging or that you thought was negative at the time. I think the work of Jonathan Edwards, the American revivalist preacher here, is useful because he made a distinction between what he called natural and spiritual gratitude. So natural gratitude flows out of us effortlessly when good things happen to us. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about when people are keeping the gratitude journal and writing what good things have happened to them. But gracious gratitude is of a different order, and that's the gratitude we express for God and his goodness even when surrounded by difficult circumstances. And this is, of course, expressed in Paul's letter to the Thessalonians about giving thanks in all circumstances. I think the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, he wrote a book with Joan Chichester, For All That Has Been, Thanks. And the central thrust of that, really, is this kind of spiritual gratitude, this acknowledgement of gratitude anchored in trust in the goodness of the giver and not simply how good their gifts might make us feel in the short term. So I would say the virtue of gratitude is more than a means of capitalising on positive events. It could be part of it. But I would say that gratitude could be redemptive as well, enabling us to finally give thanks for difficult times and experiences that have been very challenging to us, forged in the crucible of suffering. So I think that the positive psychological approach to gratitude, again, could be enriched by taking these sorts of insights on board. And it wouldn't be difficult to do that because the positive psychological research on gratitude could be linked to research on concepts like post-traumatic growth in order to have a kind of a secular analogue, if you like, of the idea of spiritual gratitude. So, summing up, forgiveness, gratitude and hope, often conceived within psychology as enduring personal resources that can be cultivated. The benefits are often grounded instrumentally. So subjective well-being is in the foreground. You feel better, you have better health if you're forgiving, if you're grateful, if you're hopeful and optimistic. The other thing is that positive psychology tends to focus on the individual rather than the collective aspects of virtue. And I've said that actually virtues are sustained with others. Obviously, the example of how hope is not just an intrapersonal phenomenon, it's sustained in communion with others. How forgiveness isn't just about extending forgiveness to others, it's also about appropriating it oneself. So in this presentation, I've aimed to show that these perspectives in positive psychology could be broadened, not necessarily with an explicit sort of faith agenda, but we can learn from theology how to accept forgiveness ourselves as well as extend it to others. This aspect is far less researched within positive psychology. Forgiveness is a virtue we participate in as both receivers and givers. Similarly, hope isn't a purely internal resource. While there are aspects of hope that are under our control, hope is kindled and sustained with other people. So we can work on being more hopeful, we can work on generating more optimistic explanatory style, and that may be good for us. But there's more to hope than that. And finally, gratitude certainly helps us to feel good, but there is more to the virtue of gratitude than simply feeling good. So for a simple introduction to these ideas, I've written 4 books based on the topics that I subjected to an interdisciplinary analysis in my PhD. You'll notice there's one on courage as well. And these are for children aged 8 to 12. I've tried to distill some of these central insights into a story with teacher or parent notes as well. So if anybody's interested in that, let me know. It always infuriates me that they forgot to put the question mark on courage on that book, and I never noticed it. So there we go. So thank you very much for your kind attention, and I think I hand over to you now. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gulliford, for such an interesting walk through 3 major virtues and for highlighting some important issues. And I'm grateful to be here at Boston College today to offer a few remarks. And we've not met in person, but have been aware of each other's work, and I'm so sympathetic to your points. I'm going to mostly expand on some themes that I think are really important on these issues and point to some possibilities for those of you who want to pursue work in these areas. Sitting with your talk ahead of time, I came to this title for my remarks: Virtue Formation Begins in the Face of the Other, drawing on Levinas, drawing on relational theologies, relational development theories, and I'll explain a little bit more about that. Back many years ago, with the theologian Laurent Schultz, we did an interdisciplinary book called The Faces of Forgiveness, using this theme, this motif of facing, which you could deal with in a scientific sense, as faces are something we often use to interpret our people we're in relation with, experiences with people. But face as a metaphor gets to a deeper sense of presence. And so from a relational development perspective, it does challenge the kind of Cartesian human agency emphasis that you rightly critiqued in Western psychology. Facing can reference relational presence as we encounter people in our lives. And from a relational development perspective, our capacities to practice virtues like forgiveness or hope are really grounded in those relational experiences. I like to say sometimes that virtues are not microwavable. There are certainly practices we could learn, but for better and for worse, we are largely up against what a lot of our relational experiences have been in life. Erik Erikson made that point about the virtue of hope. Most people who've studied Psych 101 know that Erikson said the first stage of child development, infant development really, is trust versus mistrust. And Erikson thought hope is formed through those early encounters that foster a basic sense of trust or mistrust. Not that it can't change over time. I'm going to get to some clinical stuff in a moment. The good news is that we can change over time. But our relational experiences, who we relate to, who's important in our lives and in our psyches and in our worlds, will have a lot to do with the health of virtues we can practice. Now, that's a content perspective. At the process perspective, you've also highlighted the need for interdisciplinary work, which I applaud and affirm. And actually, if we reverse figure and ground a little bit, we might realize good interdisciplinary work is going to require the cultivation of some of these virtues. I don't know how many of you have been in rooms in universities with scholars of different disciplines talking with one another. I've been in a lot of those meetings. Do you know how often they go well? Maybe half the time. It actually isn't that easy to do really good interdisciplinary work. Academia, as you probably realize, can be so turfy. People can use intellectual work for ego needs. So actually, good interdisciplinary work is more like a virtuous craft that's going to require healthy relational development, virtues like intellectual humility, the willingness to listen to others, to be curious, to try to understand their perspectives. Now, some colleagues and I have been pushing forward some of the virtue work in the mental health care system. David Goodman, one of our hosts here, is involved in this project, funded by the Templeton Foundation. How often do you think virtues like forgiveness, gratitude come up in mental health settings? We really don't know a lot about that. There's a lot of structured interventions for these virtues, but there really has been very little frontline clinical research in the nitty-gritty of daily clinical practice to understand how these virtues play out. So my co-PI Jesse Owen and I have been leading a project that involves our lab at Danielson Institute, several other groups here in town, the Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders, a project at McLean Hospital. The McLean project is particularly interesting, led by Mary Zanarini, who's a lifelong researcher of borderline personality disorder, really one of the most severe mental health disorders. And she started trying to integrate some of these virtues into treatment in a very thoughtful way, not like pushing people to forgive or to be grateful, but to explore some of the practices that might help and some of the difficulties with that. It actually took off so much at McLean that she had to hire extra staff, and it quickly became the largest outpatient clinic over there. Now, who would have thought at a psychiatric hospital, world-renowned psychiatric hospital, there would be that much interest in virtue? But when probed in a way that does justice to relational themes, that really tries to understand people's relational experiences and not necessarily push this kind of hyper-autonomous self, do-it-yourself, which wouldn't work in the context of suffering. We're finding that a lot of folks are interested in exploring these themes. Our overall idea is that virtues over time may grow in the capacity of good mental health treatment, that's probably going to be accounted for or mediated, would be the fancy statistical language, by healthy relational experiences and the capacity to practice emotion regulation, and that's what is going to ultimately lead to the kind of relational virtues that would prompt eudaimonic well-being, not just subjective well-being or happiness, but actually the ability to relate well with others, to have a sense of meaningful life purpose, to be trying to grow. So that's what we're finding some evidence for. I'd also like to draw out your point, Dr. Gulliford, about critical positive psychology. And the Seligman movement was really first wave positive psychology. Let's bring positive themes into psychology, which is focused on pathology traditionally. We're now at what some would call third wave positive psychology, which has included a greater emphasis on cultural diversity, facing systemic realities of social injustice, trying to look, as you suggested, more at the communal, institutional, collective level of things. There's also growing research from our lab and from others that show that social privilege can prompt a kind of flourishing that really isn't the ultimate sort of flourishing that we maybe ought to be interested in from a social ethics, from a theological point of view. I mean, this raises questions to think about. What's the difference between forms of flourishing that are easily facilitated by social privileges? And what are the forms of thriving collective well-being or aspects of flourishing that might be accessible for those who are in suffering? This third wave positive psychology is more dialectical in orientation as well, not just focusing on the positive, but focusing on the existential struggles, you might say, of these virtues. So in our training program at Danielson, we found it interesting to actually say, we'd like to do a training on envy and gratitude. You know what's good about that is actually some people really don't have any interest in gratitude, but envy sounds interesting, and so they'll come to discuss that. And others are really drawn to gratitude. But part of what we believe from a relational development perspective and from a clinical perspective is that we won't simply talk our way into mature forms of these virtues by trying to just focus on the positive. And we're going to need to focus on our struggles and to turn them inside out. What are some kinds of envy that aren't purely vice? What is at the root of envy, actually? Is there a kind of desire for something that might even be spiritual or existential? What about humility? Is there a place to kind of admit our struggles with narcissism and to explore what's really going on in that aspect of development? One of the people on our team, Laura Kaptari, coined the term virtue bypass for one of our concerns. Virtue bypass, similar to the concept of spiritual bypass, is when we might want to, sort of like virtue signaling, we might want to appear virtuous or think of ourselves as virtuous, but it's not really authentic. It's not really grounded in relational development, and it isn't going to show long-term mental health benefits, I don't think. Lisa Tessman's work, Burdened Virtues, is another lead I would offer to you from a feminist perspective. We could raise questions about ways certain virtue concepts have been burdensome to women, to people of color, to others from non-dominant groups, and even lead us to ask the question, which I appreciate your point about we could try to be virtuous simply for our own benefit, and that is probably ultimately limited relationally. But I think from a critical perspective, we could also ask, who has been expected to be unselfish? Who are the folks in our communities, in our country, in the world, who aren't really allowed to be selfish? By selfish, I mean put their own needs before others. So those are burden virtue questions that we should also be considering. There's interesting literature on the ways some virtues might actually help us in culturally diverse settings, in caring about social justice. There's a body of research there that could also extend these relational questions you've highlighted, the way these virtues might actually facilitate our efforts to relate across cultural differences and care about issues like racism, sexism, poverty. So in short, I want to affirm this invitation to think more relationally, to think in more interdisciplinary terms, to think about sources of change in human development that involve facing and being faced in ways that can foster authentic virtue change. In our clinic, we found one of the key predictors for clients over time for growth in virtues like forgiveness and gratitude. Really, in our context, wasn't that the therapist said, hey, do you want to be more forgiving? I can guide you to a 3-step meditation on how to do that. Actually, it's really seeming to be the relational dynamics where forgiveness or gratitude isn't really named. There's just a constructive, authentic relational process that's unfolding. And so we actually have longitudinal data showing that the ratings of the relational dynamics by therapists and their clients done blind to each other is predictive of growth in these relational virtues over time. That's predictive of growth in well-being, declines in symptoms. It's really a relational model of how virtue can happen. And this raises one final question as we wrap up is, where will we find relational ecologies to grow in these ways? We're quite concerned about helping professionals in particular, but folks in general, of where can you find places to connect with others that might foster the authentic growth in relational virtues. So we're currently working on a project to try to create those spaces for therapists, spiritual leaders, and others to try to foster that kind of growth. So thank you so much for your lecture, and thank you for your time here today.
We do have time for a few questions. If people have questions, we'd be happy to pass a mic around and you could ask of our speakers if you would like.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and the response as well. I'm wondering, you both still seem attached to the positive psychology framework, and I'm wondering what it would take for you to decide to jettison that and to move beyond that. And just kind of by way of example, I was recently doing some work with teachers, and in positive psychology there is this PERMA framework where the very first part of it, the P, is for positive emotions. And I asked the teachers to talk about the negative side of, the positive side of negative emotions. And it was one of the most animated discussions that I've ever encountered. They had opportunities to talk about emotions like envy, disgust, anger, sorrow, grief, and they needed that. And it kind of made me wonder, have we been pushing this whole positive psychology framework too hard for too long, and it might be time to move beyond that? Thank you.
Thank you. I completely agree with this. And actually, from within my position at the University of Northampton as Associate Professor in Positive Psychology, I'm actually trying to sort of take on these challenges from the inside. And one of the things I do in terms of so-called negative and positive emotion is I actually blow apart the idea that there's any such dichotomy. Obviously, emotions are the right emotion for the right reason, to the right degree, at the right time, an Aristotelian approach. And so one of the things I do in my first year course is actually I bring in that kind of critique and say this division of emotions into positive and negative, we need to question that. I also say we need to question the VIA sort of framework as well. Obviously, there are multiple questions about the higher level virtues and how things are organized and how it was derived. But I think the best way I can get people to be more critical of positive psychology is in the way I teach it. And I teach it in a very critical way. So that's sort of how I've been trying to, as you said, do away with the framework. I mean, I'm not doing away with it. but I'm actually expanding its horizons and critiquing it from within. And I think that actually leaves my students with a much more critical view, taking on some of the insights of the third wave positive psychology that Steve mentioned, looking at positive psychology in its sociological context, the question, of social justice, whether everybody's free to pursue this subjective well-being in the same way. So certainly at my university, I was appointed to be initially a senior lecturer in positive psychology and then associate professor. But I am doing my best to kind of expand beyond that and to look at philosophical questions of eudaimonia as well. What is happiness? What is a life well lived? What is flourishing? That goes beyond the kind of fare of the traditional positive psychology. So thank you for the question. And I hope you feel somewhat reassured by my answer. Thank you.
Yeah, I would similarly say I'm not really using the framework. I'm more of a dialectical psychologist, but I would answer this way too. There's a lot of settings in, say, the mental health world where I think there's inadequate attention given to strengths, to positive experiences. And I don't think that by exploring those we need to somehow just be positive all the time. But I am concerned that I think it's dehumanizing in mental health settings when there isn't attention to growth, to well-being, and not just the absence of symptoms. I mean, the Western medical model of the United States is basically based on treatment to reduce symptoms, which I think is great. We should reduce symptoms of distress. But I believe very strongly we should try to also help people live meaningful, full lives to the extent possible.
Yeah, I think I was wondering about what you said about the interest in like diversity and adding, more emphasis on systemic issues in dialectical psychology. And I was wondering what role does, resistance to systemic injustice play? Like, is righteous anger or like resistance a virtue? Because I think this idea of like hope and gratitude being a virtue kind of, in a way, de-emphasizes resistance, and sometimes that justice does not look positive.
Yeah, great point. Actually, in the work we've done on forgiveness, we frame forgiveness and justice as a dialectic, that both are valuable and actually difficult to balance, and we've done treatment studies where we've been engaging that perspective. But just in my research team this week, we were having a really interesting conversation where, what I would say is anger can be a virtue just as much as forgiveness can. Now, if you do a lit search on anger as a virtue, you're going to find probably 1 or 2 articles, and if you do forgiveness, you're going to find 5,000, okay? But if we really think about what's the definition, and actually forgiveness or anger could be practiced in ways that aren't virtuous as well. It's actually challenging to turn forgiveness or anger into really constructive practices that benefit both self and other. And so I think anger against injustice and other forms of suffering can definitely be virtuous.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add on that when we talk about resilience, because of course this is foregrounded a lot in positive psychological discourse as a virtue to instill in the young, we should be, promoting resilience. I always say to the students, for whose benefit? It's not a virtue to be resilient in a system that needs to be changed. So essentially, I try to get a similar point across, that actually you need to look at the virtue and where it could shade into a vice, if actually what's really behind it is keeping people subjected, where resilience wouldn't be a virtue, or gratitude, or people being forced to forgive when actually they've suffered injustice. So I think it's very important, the point you make. This has got to be taught in a sensitive way that doesn't actually further victimise people who've already been victimised.
One more question, please.
So when we were talking about the psychological benefits of forgiveness, hope, and gratitude, I was wondering the kind of population that research was done on, and if there's any research that exists on how those three can actually be psychological risks for certain populations.
So you were saying about risks for certain populations. Yeah, well, of course, I had that in mind in my previous comment, really, about there is a risk, of course, with forgiveness that actually people may feel kind of forced to forgive too soon. Those people may have suffered already a great deal. So obviously, it's a difficult topic. The same way that telling people to be grateful for the little that they have could be problematic as well. Now, of course, the research has been done on a range of different populations. I haven't actually conducted any of those interventions that I referenced. But I think the key issue really is that people would have to sign up to them of their own free will, not to have it forced upon them. And obviously, my concern that I was talking then about victimising people further, it's something that people should do only when they feel that they want to do it. So that's what I would say in broad terms about it. I don't know if you've had anything specific about populations.
Well, one other thing I would add, and there is really interesting cross-cultural research on some of these virtues, probably especially forgiveness and gratitude, but this is maybe a dangerous claim to make in a room that has lots of philosophers and virtue ethics experts in it. But across most virtue traditions, the idea isn't to practice one virtue all of the time. So like the idea of being forgiving in every situation, that isn't really necessarily the best of that virtue. The challenge of practical wisdom is to read situations and to come to practice the particular virtues that are best for that situation. Now that's a tall order, right? That's a very tall order. But I think that coincides with the concern that Laura Kaptari has raised about virtue bypass, where someone may get stuck trying to practice the same virtue over and over in ways that are either have been colonized into them or that are just not adaptive at all. And there's not a flexible repertoire of other strengths to utilize. So those are questions that we need to really push forward and think a lot more about.